And we are live. It is Wednesday, July 1st, 2020, 5 o'clock p.m. We are on time today, for which I think you should send your personal appreciations to Eric Schmidt and Sergey Brin. And for the first time in many a moon, I have Boris Johnson news for you.
Oh my God.
The Independent reports Boris Johnson news, that is actually in the headline, live UK to offer new route to citizenship for Hong Kongers, as Keir Starmer says Prime Minister flippant on lockdown easing. So, it's not just me, it's even the Independent that says there's Boris Johnson news. It is relevant to the show today. So that's why I bring it to you. Look, we are not allowed to have fun anymore. And people in Hong Kong are really not allowed to have fun anymore. But in lieu of fun, we have Alvin Cheung, who is, as his Twitter feed reminds us, tragically vindicated. Is that what? Unfortunately vindicated?
Unhappily, but it'll do.
You can throw a few extra adjectives in there. I think there's a little more emotion than that.
And we have, and Alvin is, as longtime viewers of this show knows, associated with the NYU. What is the center called at NYU, Alvin?
U.S. Asia Law Institute.
The U.S. Asia Law Institute. He is originally from Hong Kong and is currently in Canada. We also have Jordan Schneider. And Jordan Schneider, the last time I saw Jordan Schneider was in the Brookings cafeteria back when we were still allowed to have fun. We had a quick cup of coffee before I had to dash because there was some impeachment event going on and so I was incredibly rude, Jordan, and but I hope we at least paid for your coffee. In the meantime, Jordan, for present purposes, Jordan is the host of the awesome podcast which Lawfare has now eaten up at China
Acquired.
Talk. What's that?
Acquired. It was a minority deal.
Yeah, exactly. We have subsumed, acquired, welcomed into the family. For those of you who do not subscribe to China Talk, you really should. Jordan interviews all kinds of interesting people about all kinds of interesting China-related stuff, including most recently, I was really floored by the episode on, it's not most recently, but it's the one that's really at the top of my mind, this incredible episode about the relationship between the Tiananmen Square anniversary and the Black Lives Matter protests with Evan Osnos. Jordan, welcome to In Lieu of Fun. Alvin, welcome back to In Lieu of Fun. Wish we had something more pleasant to talk about today.
I feel like Alvin seconds from tears.
Do you have a gin and tonic, Alvin?
I do indeed, yes.
Good. You're going to need it. Let's start, Alvin, if you will, with an update. What is going on? I guess it is now 5 a.m. or so in Hong Kong. So what was going on yesterday in Hong Kong?
So the latest is that the Hong Kong police have reportedly arrested several hundred people for demonstrating against the new quote-unquote national security law that has been imposed on the territory. As I understand it, about 10 of them are being charged with offences under this new law. And, well, it remains to be seen what will become of them, but I suspect we'll very soon find out.
And the last time we talked, it was still unclear what the national security law covered, save that it was A, vague, and B, it was feared, and clearly rightly, that it was going to cover a whole lot of traditional political speech. Do we now know the parameters of the law?
We do, but that doesn't make it any less vague. So just to give a flavor of how broad the reach is, encouraging Hong Kong residents to despise or hate the Hong Kong SAR or PRC governments is considered a national security offense. Article 38 of the law also declares that it applies to acts performed outside of Hong Kong by people who are not Hong Kong permanent residents.
So
in other words,
in
lieu of fun is putting us in danger right now. Alvin, do you think Jiang Zemin memes give me immunity? Is that a get out of jail free card?
No, and
wait, you have to explain that. I don't understand.
So Jiang Zemin, the former premier of China, is now like the king of memes. So
like he personally, or like people have made him into?
No, he's like 94.
Yeah, but so he is, his image, his image, like whatever, has become has become a meme in China or Hong Kong or both.
But I'm not sure, Alvin, what's the meme experience of Jiang Zemin within Hong Kong territories?
Can't say that I've encountered Jiang Zemin as much. So this may be a phenomenon that's passed us by, or it may just be a reflection of things passing me by in my absence.
I think this is super interesting. So Jordan, say a little bit more about this. So people have used him as a meme, and you made a joke that Alvin could have a get out of jail free card if he phrased something in a meme. Does that mean that like what do these memes mean? What have they taken on? Are they subversive, or are they the opposite of subversive?
They're totally not subversive. Basically, he's really old and hasn't died, which is pretty remarkable for someone who's lived as an eventful a life as him and is now, I think, in his 90s. So
can you tell us a little bit about his life, why he's a figure and what he stands for, kind of?
Well, he was the premier of China. I don't remember the exact dates. It was in the late 90s. He was in charge of the PRC when the handover took place, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay.
And, has been one of these people over the past 30 years who, there are always rumors about him being able to pull some strings, and he has a lot of, media connections with Phoenix News, which is one of the main outlets on the mainland, and so one of the elder statesmen of the CCP, and he's not seen in public all that much because he's he's a very aged man. But I think during the most recent plenum, what was this, in 2017 or 2018, he went to one of Xi's speeches and sat there for 5 hours, trying to stay up along. He took a nap at one point, and he's a not particularly threatening political figure, and I think is sort of so he's such an oddity at this point that there was a moment for a few months where Jiang Zemin stickers on WeChat were hot and everyone was throwing them around. I think tragically 3 or 4 months ago, WeChat deleted all the Jiang Zemin stickers in everyone's sticker library. So he is no longer as much of the sticker lexicon as he was, 1 or 2 years ago.
So it's kind of a good-hearted, look
at he's everyone's old, really old grandpa who no one really remembers.
Elder statesman, safe patriotism, fun, kind of like how we'd feel about Joe Biden if he wasn't running for president.
Up to a
Yeah, I
point.
mean, Alvin, please, more context.
No, so
Yes.
There are always these reports of palace intrigues in Beijing, and the idea that there's a political faction headed by Jiang Zemin that may or may not be getting along with the faction that Xi Jinping represents. So there's a lot of noise and a lot of smoke, but not very much light when it comes to discussions of this sort of thing.
What do you mean by that, though? Like,
it's like Kremlinology. Everybody's trying to figure out what's happening through the most indirect, vague clues possible.
Okay, that makes more sense. So why would it? So sorry to harp on this again, but like, I know that you're like explaining really basic stuff that is also kind of like I sound like it's like explaining to your parents, like, why like milkshake duck is like a meme or like, or whatever. But I don't
listen to Reply All, so I'm actually probably more out of the loop nowadays. But anyways, please.
No,
Kate.
I just really think that this is kind of fascinating. So when you said that, like what would like cloaking a mess, I know that a lot of this Kremlin speak, as Alvin says, like a lot of this kind of stuff ends up happening in like getting wrapped up, like subversive talk ends up getting wrapped up in like harmless talk or like masked in or like whatever. And so is that what you were kind of referring to, Jordan?
No, I don't think there was anything all that subversive. I mean, there's like, I think there's an undertone whenever you talk about any premier that isn't Xi Jinping, is sort of always in the context of Xi's rule. So, when you see articles that are, the very few articles you see that are criticizing Xi generally compare Xi's rule to, what life was like under who, or what life was like under Jiang Zemin. So I think that's the kind of underlying thing a little bit with all of it. But, for the average 17-year-old who sees this like 90-year-old, like my little brother who's 20 has absolutely no relationship with George Bush Sr. And like sending a photo around of George Bush, of like Carter throwing up at the speech in, I forget his university. Anyways, I don't even remember who it was who threw up in Tokyo. But
no, that was George Bush Sr.
That was George Bush Sr. Okay, I got it right. It's like totally divorced from any sort of statement. But, I think for the majority of people, but there are certainly some who see.
But I'm super dense, Jordan. What does this have to do with Hong Kong?
Nothing. Well, he took over Hong Kong, so.
This is just a very long tangent based on a meme. Is that right?
Let me pull it back to Hong Kong.
Okay.
So a couple of years ago, I think it was 2015, several people involved with the mighty Current Publishing House and the Causeway Bay bookstore were abducted and taken to mainland China. One of them, a Swedish citizen called Gui Minhai, was taken from Thailand by Chinese state security. Another, Li Bo, a British citizen, was taken from the streets of Hong Kong by Chinese black bag brigades. Li and Gui were both paraded in front of state-run media, made to give public confessions, made to renounce their foreign citizenship. And they have, even Li Bo, who managed to escape back to Hong Kong, remains permanently silenced. Of the five, one of them spoke up publicly in Hong Kong. He's since fled to Taiwan. He's opened a bookstore there. He continues to encounter some degree of political interference. And what the national security law means is that that's what's in store for everybody now. Yeah. There's extraterritorial effect the femtosecond you set foot in Hong Kong territory, whether it's the transit lounge of Hong Kong International Airport or even a Cathay Pacific flight, you are at risk of being rendered to the mainland for trial. That's what that means.
So let's talk about that, because I am, I go back and forth about how to think about this, but one way to think about it is, why does the CCP want to do this? And the answer has to be because they perceive no particular negative consequences from doing it, right? So my first question is that right? That they're simply not afraid of any negative blowback either within Hong Kong, which they can now suppress, or from the international community. Is that fair?
I think that's absolutely fair. Dominic Raab, the UK Foreign Secretary, has only just said within the last 12 hours or so that the PRC has breached the Sino-British Joint Declaration. This was the 1984 treaty that governed how Hong Kong was to be run, supposedly until 2047. Well, as early as 2014, round about the start of the Umbrella Movement pro-democracy protests, we had PRC ambassadors to the UK, we had Hong Kong ministers for constitutional and mainland affairs openly declaring that the joint declaration had lapsed. Here were Chinese officials publicly repudiating the joint declaration, and nobody said anything, nary a peep. The UK certainly hasn't covered itself in glory. Europe has not covered itself in glory. And in fact, to date, very few governments have done anything except express concern. The strongest step we've seen so far is Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross's move to restrict dual use and weapons exports to Hong Kong. Nobody else is even remotely close to doing that.
So has any government done what they should do?
No, that's the very short answer. And in particular, I would single out the UK here. Yeah. The BNO, which you referred to, was a creature of late 70s, early 80s British politics, and in particular, the fear that the home islands would become inundated by Hong Kongers. And it was that fear that prompted the British Nationality Act, which created the British National Overseas second-class citizenship. You're a subject of the Queen, but you don't actually have the right to live on the home islands, which made it absolutely useless. And since then, the UK has not exactly covered itself in glory, particularly under the Cameron premiership with, well, I have an adjective to describe that policy, but I shall refrain from using it in a family-friendly environment.
Oh, no, you can fucking say whatever you want on In Lieu of Fun.
All right, well, some of you will get the joke, some of you won't, but I refer to it as a particularly pig-headed foreign policy. Yep, you know what I'm on about.
All right, so Jordan, help me out here, because I am trying to figure out why China perceives so little to fear here. On the one hand, they look and they say, well, whatever the Independent may say, Boris Johnson is not going to let 3 million Hong Kongers come to London. Although I would add that Mr. Trudeau might well let a few million come to Vancouver. I mean, he already has. And right, there's I think realistically, the actual address for a lot of Hong Kongers is probably Canada, not the UK, right, Alvin?
That's correct. At last reckoning, there were over 300,000 Canadian citizens in Hong Kong. So yes, I expect about 150, worst case scenario, 150,000 of them end up in the Greater Toronto area, and 150,000 of them end up in the Greater Vancouver area.
Yeah, I mean, you could imagine a significant population mobility, but it's probably not. It's probably only secondarily a UK one. Under Donald Trump, you can't imagine any significant numbers of Hong Kongers getting asylum in the United States. But you could imagine it under a different administration, say a Joe Biden administration. So my question, Jordan, is why does the Chinese government perceive so little to fear in the international reaction to what it's doing here. So far they've been pretty cautious about, other than in the South China Sea, they say a lot of things about Taiwan, but they don't actually do very much. And the world has agreed that we don't care about Uyghurs or Tibetans. Why is a different question, but I think it's fair to say they've perceived they can get away with anything there. But Hong Kong is a special case. Why are they so confident that they can get away with this?
Well, getting away with it, there are lots of definitions. Getting away with it can mean a lot of different things, right? I think at the end of the day, they made the calculation that having 500,000 Hong Kongers leave Hong Kong is not as big a deal as having protests in the street, which from a regime stability standpoint is probably the right trade-off. When it comes to the international reaction, Alvin just sort of gave you the rundown that it's been really milquetoast. And even the former colonial mother is dragging their feet, and we have Donald Trump who's prioritizing a trade deal. Seems like he's prioritizing a trade deal at the moment over state being more aggressive in favor of Hong Kong rights. The more
and he's
dramatic
pro locking up Uyghurs, apparently.
It's very upsetting. I think the biggest impact that this will likely have, which was sort of already baked in with the response in 2019 to the protests, was the response domestically in Taiwan and the sort of closing of the book of any mainstream view that getting into a one country, two systems deal, integrating more won't have significant impacts for for the freedoms that Taiwanese cherish so dearly. So while it may not lead to the outrage and government action in the West that Ben and Alvin and many others and myself included are clearly hoping for, Taiwan is a democracy and people's opinions matter there. And it will be a long time before voters forget what happened, right across the water.
Can I just quickly ask, has this gotten worse because of the pandemic? We all know that the protests were going on. It was like a very uphill battle for the protesters, but is there a sense the Chinese government is taking advantage by how much all nation states are kind of focused domestically right now to kind of seize this moment to do these things? As like Ben said, they wouldn't have dared to have done this within kind of in the eyes of other states. They've left Taiwan alone for years, everything else. What do you think, Alvin?
I think the specific timing may have been somewhat opportunistic, but I think that even if the pandemic hadn't happened, that Beijing would try something like this sooner or later in any event. The saber rattling towards Taiwan never really stopped since Tsai Ing-wen was elected president there. And as for Hong Kong, well, I've written about this elsewhere, but there's been a couple of long-running trends, like the steady self-aggrandizement of Beijing's authority over Hong Kong and the chipping away at the relevance, if not independence, of the judiciary. So, if the pandemic hadn't happened, the odds were still reasonably good that something like this would have happened within the next 3 to 5 years.
Yeah, this is entirely consistent with with Xi Jinping's governing philosophy. And 2050, he's probably dead by then. Being able to have this in his cap is something he's, for whatever he thinks of his legacy, is something he's kind of solved and put to bed. I think it's an outcome of seeing what happened in 2019 as much as anything else. But as Alvin said, it's not surprising that this day come. It's moderately surprising that this day came in 2020.
All right, let's talk, Alvin, about the protest movement. The stakes just went or the risk just went way up for the kids who were out there. Is it over, or should we expect Czechoslovakia 68 kind of situation, where people are going to be out there being really courageous under really dangerous circumstances?
I mean, judging by the number of tankies floating around the internet, it does certainly seem like Czechoslovakia in 68. But, what's happening now in Hong Kong is a lot of the people who are still there don't have anywhere else to go. Most of the people who could afford to leave through one means or another have already done that. People of Joshua Wong's generation, of Nathan Law's generation, they don't have foreign passports. They don't have anywhere else they can go to easily. So when you have an entire generation of people with, at this point, nothing to lose, and they know that with the knowledge that if they get caught, that we're talking minimum sentences of 3 to 5 years in some cases, then I don't think that's a recipe for rapid pacification.
And if these people are young, tech savvy, and quite courageous, and they're also creative, in terms of how they're manipulating the system, the technology available to them, the technology available to the Chinese and the Hong Kong government and the police. What's the next step if they're gonna turn the amps up another to 11 or whatever the next step up is? What's the thing they haven't been doing that they could be doing?
It's a good question. I really don't feel like I am in a position where I can comment critically on what frontline protesters should or should not be doing.
Oh, I wasn't saying should. I was asking a more predictive question.
Right, yes.
On what's the thing they've held back from that they haven't done, that if you say there's, kind of all bets are off now, that that's next.
The analogy I spoke to with Anthony Dapperan on my show a few weeks ago was Belfast. And the Hong Kong protesters have not been trying to kill police. And it would be an awful thing if that was the option that they thought was the only way out. And I think that the level of violence we talked about on our podcast was sort of balletic in a way, in that both the police and the protesters, there was one gunshot at one point that I think like the one Hong Kong policeman fired his gun once over the course of that entire saga. And that was a massive, massive news moment, and, led to a protest of a few 100,000 people. So even though the images you saw of, things being on fire and protesters running back and forth and the siege at the university were very dramatic, there were not fatalities. And hopefully it will not come to that. The other sort of analogy and difference with the with Czechoslovakia is, of course, the young people in that moment, there was a moment where they had government support. And while on the one hand, there's clearly it was brief, but there was it was I think where Belfast was sort of split down the middle, right? The mainland China is very large and is very well resourced, and as smart and creative as these students are, there's no inkling that anything with regards to public opinion or elite opinion on the mainland is going to change with Hong
Belfast
Kongers
is
making more and more extreme, doing more and more extreme things.
But Belfast is a bit of a mischievous analogy, I think, because
Mhm.
the Irish Republican tradition dating back, to 1916 and much earlier has a streak of violent revolutionary quality that is simply not a part of the Hong Kong protest tradition.
Yeah.
And the 1969 provisionals are upset with the IRA, the old time IRA, because they're they've kind of lost their violent revolutionary fervor, right?
Yeah.
And I just think that's whatever the merits of that tradition are in the Irish Republican context, it's a super, that is not a tradition that is going to be created in Hong Kong overnight with the true Leviathan of the CCP kind of hovering over it.
Totally.
Which is much more violent, much more, than the British Empire ever was.
And let's not forget, Hong Kong is not an armed society. There are
exactly.
no citizens have guns. So,
right. And Belfast was armed even before 69, right? 69, they start bringing in higher power weaponry, but it's not like they were unarmed before that. And so
yeah.
I just think you're starting from a very different point of you're not dealing with armed confrontation with mainland China dating back to Cromwell, right? And so I'm curious, Alvin, like you have said a number of times, both on this show and on the Lawfare podcast, that you think it has the capacity to become very violent. What does violent mean to you? And is that like guns violent, or is that like a lot of Molotov cocktails and beatings kind of violent?
Probably more the latter, just because firearms are just hard to come by in Hong Kong unless you are in the police or in the People's Liberation Army. Will the attacks become less discriminate? There's a very real risk of that.
Yeah. All right. Should we take some questions from the audience? We have a question from Rachel Coit, a pair of questions from Rachel Coit. Where is Rachel? Hang on. There she is. Rachel, the floor is yours. Unmute yourself.
So hi. Thank you guys for taking my questions. The first one, I think you kind of answered. It was about the memes. I was wondering if the memeing was at all related to a Wu Mao phenomenon, but it sounds more like it was just, it's not. Sorry?
It was pretty sort of milquetoast mainstream.
Yeah.
It's kind of he's just like any other celebrity, I think, for 99% of people.
My second question is about the rumors of a power struggle within the mainland government between Xi and Li Keqiang. And if you think that there's actually any merit to that. I've been hearing vague whisperings about it, and sort of related, do you think that issues related to Hong Kong would have been dealt with any differently had anyone other than Xi been in power? Thank you.
I am highly skeptical of the idea that, if somebody else were in charge, things for Hong Kong would turn out dramatically differently. I think structurally, Beijing-Hong Kong relations were always going to be difficult. Beijing always had, a pretty sizable finger on that scale, and the party tends to react very badly to perceived challenges to its authority. That is not going to change regardless of who happens to be on top.
Susan Santry, the floor is yours. Unmute yourself. You gotta unmute yourself.
Oh, and by the way, Wu Mao are paid internet commenters. Wu Mao is a term for 50 cents, which is what they were supposedly paid per post.
Excellent. Okay, Susan, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. I was wondering, don't you think Hong Kong and China have been on a collision course for years? And this is inevitable that China would overtake Hong Kong.
It's an interesting question. Was it ever possible for this to work, or is Susan's question just the assuming the inevitability of what happened?
Look, in an infinite universe, anything is possible, but I wouldn't necessarily bet on a particular outcome. The particular system of devolved government that Hong Kong was, well, I say not really given, but that was imposed upon Hong Kong, would have relied upon extraordinary restraint from Beijing and officials in Hong Kong who were able and willing to uphold the city's autonomy. Now, for the first few years, at least, there was some measure of restraint from Beijing. And we had holdover officials like Anson Chan, the chief secretary at the time, so second only to the chief executive, now retired from public life, who was reasonably well respected but across the political spectrum. But what we've seen since then is, first of all, Beijing's no longer exercising any degree of restraint. That has been a process that's been happening, as you say, for a very, very long time. And in the part of Hong Kong, we've been subjected to a series of increasingly craven governing, I hesitate to say elites, because they've certainly not behaved like them, but they have shown no ability or willingness to govern.
Yeah, I mean, it's also fundamentally a question of the trajectory of the Chinese Communist Party. I think, sitting in 1997, even sitting in 2005, it was reasonable to think that you were, on a trajectory towards a more open society, one that had some understanding that liberal values and, liberal governing values had some utility. And, the more you go down that path, the more you understand and appreciate the role that Hong Kong could play in a one country, two systems format. Once you come to 2009, 2010, towards the end of the Hu regime, and certainly by the time she gets in power, that's no longer part of the operating philosophy of the ruling party. So I think once you hit that sort of governing inflection point, then it was very hard to see a pathway in which Hong Kong could maintain its relative autonomy.
And how much of that, Jordan, do you think is a function of the fact that China just doesn't need Hong Kong that much anymore? Whereas in 1997, Hong Kong is this gateway economically to the rest of Asia, to the West. It's a economic powerhouse, and China really needs it if it's going to continue to open up economically. Now, people like me argue that US companies should be careful about getting too enamored of the idea of the Chinese market, but nobody listens to that. Nobody, the business world is all in on the idea of doing business with China, and often under humiliating and absurd terms. And so there's no, you don't really need the gateway anymore. You've got a direct access to the entity. And so, maybe the incentive to restraint in Hong Kong is limited because, if Hong Kong depopulates and, 300,000 people move to Canada and a bunch of others move to the UK and a bunch of others come here, so what?
I mean, at this point, there are plenty of high-priced English-speaking bankers and lawyers in Shanghai and Beijing to do whatever business you want to do. And you really hit the nail on the head at this point, Ben. Like, if Hong Kong becomes another Chinese city, it doesn't really have all that much impact on China's future growth trajectory, because of all the development that that has happened over the past 20 years.
There are a couple of caveats to that. The first is IPOs, particularly by mainland companies. Now that mainland companies are finding it increasingly difficult to list themselves on stock exchanges in, let's say, the US and the UK, many of them are turning to Hong Kong. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that the renminbi is still not freely convertible, whereas the Hong Kong dollar is. So, to those two limited extents, there is still some utility. And, capital markets is still going to be a thriving business in Hong Kong. The dispute resolution stuff is all going to Singapore, but there's still some scope for a severely diminished Hong Kong.
So let's drill down on that actually, and kind of like I know this has been kind of like a very pessimistic conversation, and I think that's a realistic conversation, which is just depressing. This may be a better way of putting it. But is there anything like I think that's a good question. The economic utility of Hong Kong to foreigners seems to be, in my mind, the best way to incentivize outside support for the democratic movements within Hong Kong. Is there any way that we can, as people sitting in the United States, as consumers sitting in the United States, Ben brought up before on his Twitter feed that maybe it's time to boycott China after their treatment of the Uyghurs and after everything in Hong Kong. Is that something that would help Hong Kong? Is there something to do besides like boycotting China that you could turn and do for Hong Kong as someone sitting, in the United States or Canada?
So there's the two parts to that. The first is the idea that it is in everybody's enlightened economic self-interest to preserve Hong Kong's way of life. And that was the argument that was being run for a very, very long time, not least by Hong Kong officials. And it really doesn't seem to have gained significant currency. It certainly hasn't stopped some of the most significant incursions into autonomy in the last few years. As for the second point, the time for the international community to act meaningfully in a way that would have salvaged the Hong Kong situation was at latest 6 years ago. At this point, there's not much left really beyond picking up the pieces and trying to outlast whatever regime is in Beijing.
Yeah, so, I mean,
is that the thing though? Is it outlasting the regime in Beijing? Is that the only bright spot? The only moment? Well, okay, maybe not only, but is that the biggest moment of hope that Hong Kong has? Is the downfall of the current regime and the next wave? And what does that next wave? What are people talking about that next wave looking like?
People like to talk about the Chinese Communist Party as engaging in long-term thinking and grand strategy and so on. But if you look at what they've been doing over the last few years, a lot of it is very hubristic and a lot of it is flailing around. Just within their own backyard, Asia, over the past year or so, they've picked fights with Japan, South Korea, pretty much all of ASEAN, that's the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, Australia, India. Right, pretty much everybody. Now, if you have the comfort of engaging in long-term strategic planning, you don't go and pick fights with everybody in your region at round about the same time.
Agreed. I mean, totally. So, and
Yeah,
so where
on
do we
your-
go from there?
On your point, Kate, just maybe this was 1.5 questions ago. What can be done? I'm in agreement with the Alvin pessimism. The financial wrinkles, if the U.S. really pushes on them in Hong Kong, will probably end up doing little more than accelerating financial reform domestically in China. And they'll probably find some new way to list firms or some special convertible Bitcoin, which allows folks to to get money out of the country in a regulated way or what have you. We talked about this earlier at the beginning of the show. The biggest statement you can make is now a one with involving asylum policy, which is really sad that that's not happening at all.
So I am totally for, and a very aggressive approach on the asylum front. But I also think that's kind of a rearguard action. And I do think there's an entity on the US side and the EU side that could have a major impact. And it's the business community that are all tripping over themselves to reach this elusive Chinese market, and they spend incredible amounts of money to get in, only then to find that it's actually very difficult to make money in that market. And so I guess my question is, at what point does the business community wake up and say, we are enabling great evil, and that might be defensible if there were great profits to be made? Wouldn't be moral, but it would be at least keeping faith with our shareholders. But maybe we are overselling the potential here, and the winners are the CCP. What do you think, Jordan? Is there any chance of that realization?
I mean, Ben, the head of Microsoft China and Starbucks China, they're not stupid. They know their P&Ls better than you do. So, I think certainly some companies have been disappointed. Some companies have made, billions and billions of dollars selling to and manufacturing from the Chinese market. I guess what I would say is that it is, I think the atmospherics have really changed over the past few years. And, this was something that was long in the making, both from a, U.S.-China tension perspective, as well as a, foreign company treatment within the mainland perspective. How this comes back to helping Hong Kongers, I think, is a lot of steps. And it's really, really hard to paint a picture where, Apple announces that they're no longer, working with Foxconn, which is of course a Taiwanese company making phones on the Chinese mainland, and then Xi Jinping says, "Oh wait, maybe we should give back Hong Kongers their freedoms." So there are certainly other national security or whatever benefits you could have from degrading the ties the American business community has with the mainland, but an end game in which this helps a 24-year-old Hong Konger write something on their Facebook page without being scared is very hard to see.
So you don't see a South Africa model here, like a giant divestment movement in the United States and EU actually generating political pressure? I assume because China's just too big an economy for that to be effective.
I mean, I don't think it would happen. I think the something that big would probably involve a really violent, ugly invasion of Taiwan. And even that, I'm not sure you could put really good odds on the world having a really strong stand in front of that. As Alvin was saying, I think the biggest vulnerabilities that the CCP has are ultimately domestic. when it comes, and the things that the people who protest now on the mainland China care about are very local issues with regards to governance and housing policy and land rights and whatnot. So it's all well and good to think about a sort of international boycott or what have you, but I think the weak points of the CCP are not necessarily the pressure points that the free world, I guess, can push on China are not necessarily the ones in which the CCP is most weak. What do you think, Alvin?
I mean, my two-part answer is yes, the Chinese economy is too big and corporate executives are as a whole too craven. What was striking about the extradition bill protest last year was that multiple chambers of commerce actually spoke out against it, which was unprecedented. Previously, some of them had even, whether tacitly or vocally, opposed the umbrella movement, but they seem to have accepted the NSL as a fait accompli. So, when will they change their minds, if ever? The minute after one of their board members gets put on the express train to the mainland by the Black Bag Brigades, and not a moment before.
Yeah, that seems to make sense to me. I have a question, because this is like kind of the most, like the area that I interact with the CCPA and like everything else with tech in China is basically tech companies trying to go into China, and like all of the restrictions that they were like the American tech companies refuse to kind of succumb to this, like, the censorship regime and everything else. I know Alvin is like rolling his eyes.
Yeah, that's one narrative, Kate.
Well, no, it is. It was one narrative, like especially earlier kind of in the history of the internet. But now there have been multiple companies. I'm just thinking of Dragonfly as like the most kind of like, as like the most is the kind of like the best example. Is that, if you don't have to speculate, but like, do you see, so just for people who don't know, Google for years refused on kind of moral grounds, I don't know, like to enter China, to succumb to kind of the censorship regime that was necessary to agree to in order to operate in China. And then it was turned out that like they had been kind of running their own dev of a parallel Google enterprise to compete with the dominant tech company in China, Baidu, called Dragonfly, and that was happening kind of in secret for a very long time. Well, secret to kind of the free world. Tell me if that's like a incorrect summary or anything, but that kind of was caught by surprise, because it caught a lot of people in the U.S. by surprise, because there had been such a foot stomping by Silicon Valley tech kind of libertarians that they were not going to succumb to the totalitarian kind of and censorship regimes of China just for the economic benefits. And apparently just like the honey was too sweet, they eventually gave in. I'm curious if you see that, if you hear or see of other types of companies going that way besides Dragonfly. I know Cloudflare operates there. Cloudflare has never been the most scrupulous company to begin with. But just kind of curious whether you see American companies, it just becomes too big a market for them to resist anymore. And even in light of all of this Hong Kong stuff, if you think that will make a difference.
The operating environment in Hong Kong will certainly change. Part of the national security law includes mandating that the Hong Kong government take more steps to regulate media and the internet. And there's specific provisions that say that the Hong Kong government and the PRC Foreign Ministry's Hong Kong Commissioner's Office and this yet to be set up mainland state security agency in Hong Kong shall regulate foreign NGOs and foreign companies operating in the territory. So that's the regulatory environment. And at least the Hong Kong regulatory environment. Then there's a US regulatory environment, which you know a great deal more about than I do. But just one recent example is that Google and Facebook, if I remember correctly, were trying to secure regulatory approval to open the Hong Kong and China sections of a big new internet pipeline. That approval never came. And eventually, I think they gave up on the whole idea. So, there may be a bit more of that, depending on what other steps the Commerce Secretary takes. But a lot of it, I suspect, is going to be down to US regulation and not any changes to the regulatory environment in Hong Kong or China.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll do a little bit of Google backstory because it's fun getting the whole picture. Of course, Google was there was Google.cn for most of the 2000s, and what happened was Google at some point there was some like hacking going on of Gmail emails, and then Sergey had a change of heart. He wrote this letter about how he had his family came from Eastern Europe, and he understands that freedom of speech is important. Fast forward 8-9 years, we have Pindai in charge, who evidently saw this calculation a different way. I think the dream of American content companies making a major impact in, getting into the Chinese market is dead and has been dead for a number of years now. There was there's a famous moment of Mark Zuckerberg running without a mask on Tiananmen Avenue in an attempt to woo, and of course he had the Xi Jinping book on his when he in his office or something. But the general philosophy that China has taken to foreign technology companies has been, we'd love to have you if we need you. If you are ASML and you have these like really awesome $100 million machines that we need to improve our semiconductor manufacturing capacity, of course, by all means, we'll lay out the red carpet for you. Content companies, there's very little upside for the communist government. There's already like great, the Chinese substitutes have now grown and are very, vigorous and lively, and Baidu Maps and Gaoda and whatever are just as good as Google Maps. There's not like something that the Chinese consumer is really missing by not having Facebook and Instagram, as opposed to, there's plenty of content out there to be consumed. I think the Chinese sort of like industrial policy philosophy has also not necessarily changed. 10-15 years ago, there were more things that Chinese firms couldn't do, and now there are fewer. So once there is a domestic competitor that either has the capability or has enough connections to make the case that they have the capability to MIDI or whoever regulates the particular space, then those foreign firms start having a harder and harder time.
Or a domestic competitor on whose behalf the PLA can steal the IP necessary to generate the capability.
So there were a number of Facebook profiles that were in mainland China, and all were registered, even though Facebook was not operating in China, but all were registered through Hong Kong with VPNs. I take your point, Jordan, and I don't know whether that is a desire, like if that's a subversive move, whether it's a curio kind of thing to have a Facebook profile inside that. But I'm curious why you think that so many people, like 15 million at various points, like in China, tried to have like a Facebook profile.
But 15 million isn't very much.
No, it's not. It's not. So
most of the people I knew, and God knew, it's so sad, it's past tense, who have VPNs have it because they're on Instagram, because they want, workout content. It's not having a foreign, having a VPN does not, or another friend like wanted to play Dota on Western servers. It's not a just because you have a VPN doesn't necessarily mean that you're reading the Chinese version of the New York Times and spending all your time delving into the deep dark history of the Great Leap Forward or Wenga or the Cultural Revolution. So I think like fundamentally most people on mainland China are pretty apolitical, and the VPN is sort of annoying. And sometimes like there are some Netflix movies that are kind of cool, but it's not necessarily like a proxy for liberal views or dissent. I mean, it sort of is, but is not like it does not necessarily mean there are 15 million people who all sympathize with the Hong Kong protesters, for instance.
And just to before we wrap, Alvin, I take it that's very different in Hong Kong, right?
Yes. So one of the most immediate repercussions of the national security law, and I put all those three words in scare quotes, is that a whole bunch of social media accounts went dark on Facebook and Twitter.
Right.
Everybody's moving away from insecure social media to other more secure channels, but these are all services that we here would recognize.
Signal, Telegram,
Correct.
WhatsApp.
Yes.
All right,
Yeah.
we should leave it there.
One last, sorry, I'm just going to grab a
please.
prop.
Ooh.
I hope it's
This
a
is
small
the part
child.
of the this is the part of the show with props.
Since I'm
Is
not
it a small
expecting,
child?
since I'm not expecting to return to Hong Kong anyway, I thought I'd show you this gem, which is a series of political comics from the 1990s. And since we were talking about Jiang Zemin, the then premier of China, for the People's Republic of China, and among other things, the South China Sea, I thought I would show you this, which shows that PRC foreign policy, in some ways, really hasn't changed all that much. Lee Teng-hui was the then Taiwanese president, by the way.
We will hold missile tests. We hate Lee Teng-hui. We will invade an independent Taiwan. We claim sovereignty of all of the South China Sea. And
The Spratly Islands are ours.
Got
and
it.
The
What
crowd
year
of
is that from?
this, A Lesson in Diplomacy was from August 2nd, 1995.
Ooh. Real throwback. Love it.
There you go.
Plus
Excellent.
Alvin Cheung, Jordan Schneider, thanks so much for joining us. Hope to have you back under happier circumstances, though it is a little bit hard to imagine with respect to Hong Kong what those will be in the near future. Kate, do we know who our guest is tomorrow?
we don't do, we can talk about it offline, but I was also thinking Carrie Johnson. We had talked about her before.
I would love to have Carrie anytime. Yeah, so we will get back to you on who the guest is tomorrow. Look for it on our Twitter feeds tomorrow afternoon. Until 22 hours and 57 minutes from now, Kate, what do we say?
We don't have fun anymore. So in lieu of fun, we really don't have fun and talk about how the news in Hong Kong.
Yeah, it kind of sucks.
It kind of
We will
sucks.
talk about a happier subject tomorrow, I think.
Well,
yeah, maybe.
Apart from the shooting, how was the play, Mrs. Lincoln?
Yes, exactly. Thank you, guys.
Bye.
Yeah, nice to meet you guys.